This is a video about Ken Liu's short story, which comes from his larger collection of short stories, The Paper Menagerie. And in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the questions that I'm asking you to respond to on the discussion post. A lot of my ideas are not fully formed yet. I'm trying to work through the text and figure out what it's saying, pull out quotations that might help support a tentative argument. I'd like you to elaborate on some of these ideas and answer some of these questions in your own way in the discussion post. So the first thing I want to think about is, what is the genre of this story? And you might argue that discussing the genre of the story is sort of a pointless exercise, but I think it's worth noting different genres that it could be. So magical realism, speculative fiction, fantasy, science fiction. Liu won the Nebula and the Hugo Award, so we could call this science fiction, but I think it has a lot in common, or it might be an example of magic realism. There's a separate video about magical realism that I discuss in my A Very Old Man with Enormous Wings video. But magical realism is a controversial term, but it basically boils down to some sort of story in which supernatural things happen or magical things happen in the midst of the everyday. And a lot of times the characters don't seem particularly shocked when somebody has wings or somebody levitates. They move on from that shock pretty quickly. And there's also gritty, mundane, everyday realism with magical realism. Speculative fiction, a text like The Handmaid's Tale would be an example of speculative fiction, imagining a world that could be. Fantasy, some might say that magical realism is just more highbrow or literary fantasy, which of course is unfair, but that's what some people say, that actually they're kind of the same. And science fiction. A lot of times when we think of sci-fi, we think, of course, of texts like Frankenstein, but we think of things that use technology, computers, things like that. I think you could argue that this text falls into several of these categories, but I think it's worth considering at least for a moment. More importantly, though, would this be the same without the magic? I think the story could exist without the magic. It could be a beautiful story about origami, and the origami does not come to life. The mother doesn't breathe her life force into it, but it's still a really important relic or object to the narrator. Obviously, the ending can't happen where he is carrying Lao Hu while he's purring. Obviously, that doesn't work. And some of the details are going to be a little bit different. But if this didn't have the magic, a lot of the story would be intact. So why add the magic? What does the magic add? Well, I think there's something going on with the magic. I think it must be a metaphor for something. Let's try to figure out what that is as we read through the text. One thing I want to think about is how this story is about belonging and heritage, racism, and language. I've included a quotation that I found from an academic article on the library databases about Liu as a genre mediator addressing issues of cultural translation in his short stories and forcing readers to think about questions of language and how culture is transmitted. We might think about how culture is transmitted through language, or through denying one's language, or refusing to speak a certain language, or by other people shunning that language, or even through things like origami or some sort of art form. We always want to look at the text itself first, see what the text says, not what the author says. But it's worth noting that in an interview, Liu has said that a lot of people see this story as a clash of civilizations, like East meets West, and that this narrative of a clash of civilizations is problematic. That's not really what the story is about. Because after all, when the mom moves to America, who's to say that her immigrant experience isn't the quintessential American experience? So that's something to kind of keep in the back of your minds. But of course, we always want to read the text first before we find out what the author has to say about the text. I saw in an interview that Liu talks about his own background. He is also a lawyer and a programmer. And I thought that interview, which you can find, I'll link it underneath this, I thought that interview is really interesting, where he talks about metaphor and language and constructing meaning, not just with language, but with different types of languages, legal languages, coding, things like that. So I'll link that for you too, because I thought it was relevant. So there's so many references to language, in particular English and Chinese, and there's references to the narrator refusing to speak to the mother, right? Like in this example that I have right here, one time when I was in high school, I asked Dad about the details of their meeting. his mother and his father. He was trying to get me to speak to mom again. Again, we see that the narrator and the mother are not communicating, but not because of the mother's lack of trying. If mom spoke to me in Chinese, I refused to answer her. After a while, she tried to use more English, but her accent and broken sentences embarrassed me. I tried to correct her. Eventually, she stopped speaking altogether if I were around. So in a way, the narrator, Jack, really silences his mother. And even though I think the story is so specific, right, it's also so universal. I think that's why it gets to us, why we can't help but reading it with kind of a lump in our throats. Whether our parents speak a different language, that's kind of a separate issue. I think we can all relate to trying to silence our parents in one way or another, being embarrassed by them when we're teenagers. And if your parents do speak a different language, and I'm told from friends of mine that language can be something that's an incredibly important part of your heritage. And if that is erased or put down, or if your own child doesn't want to speak in that language, doesn't want to learn the language, it's not just about the language. That can be something incredibly hurtful and incredibly tragic in a way. It's a big loss. So I think in this text, we want to think about language, yes, as a means of communication, but it's also a way that culture is transmitted, right? It's so much more than that, which I think might be why it was so important to the mother. She says in her letter, where we finally get to hear her words, where she says in her letter that she was so overjoyed that her son was going to be able to speak to her in her language, right? So, so important. And I think this is just so relatable. We cringe when we read it, but it's so, so relatable. So when the neighbor people, the neighbor ladies come over to pay a visit, obviously things do not go well. They are horribly racist. I've included some of the comments that they made right here. They ask his name, Jack. I said, that doesn't sound very Chinesey. So they have certain expectations about how he should look, what his name should be. Mom came into the dining room then. She smiled at the women. The three of them stood in a triangle around me, smiling and nodding at each other, with nothing to say until Dad came back. So again, another reference to people trying to communicate, but not really. These women who are coming to visit, they really aren't trying to communicate in an authentic way. And they speak about the narrator when they don't know that they can that he can understand him, as if he is worthless, right? They describe him in these really racist terms, but he can, of course, understand. And he begins to internalize some of this, or at least that's my view, that there's a lot of racism in this story. And then we also see a lot of internalized racism. Another quotation about language that I want to unpack a little bit. Mom looked at him, and this is when the father is saying to the mother that she needs to learn to speak English, she needs to speak English more, and he even has the audacity to say that he's made things too easy on her. Mom looked at him. If I say love, I feel it here. She pointed to her lips. If I say I feel it here. So she feels love in her heart. She puts her hand over her heart. Dad shook his head. You're in America. So, of course, this is a really heartbreaking moment. Let's think about what she's trying to say here. So why is it that when she's speaking English, right, when she says the word for love, she feels it in her mouth, right? She's saying it. But when she says it in Chinese, the language of her family, her native language, she actually feels the real emotion, where it comes from. It comes from her heart. And also, I think just the dad's very dismissive and cavalier attitude is worth commenting on. So the narrator seems to align himself a lot with his dad, or give his dad the benefit of the doubt throughout a lot of this story. And yet the mother, who it seems to me has a more fascinating history, one that we don't get access to until the very end. After all, this woman can breathe life into paper. That is sort of silenced, even from the father, that I think the narrator, at least at the beginning when he's young, feels more of a connection to than the mother. Why is it that he gives his father such a break here? Why is it that when he talks about his mother in the catalog, he says, what kind of a woman would put herself in a catalog to be bought like this? And he doesn't ask what kind of a man would buy, in quotation marks, a woman, right? Kind of an interesting alignment that he has with the father. He also distances himself from his mother when he's young, of course, but then toward the end of the story, it seems like the narrator has grown a lot and is learning a lot, and he aligns himself with her. So in the catalog, this is earlier, she said she was 18, loved to dance, spoke good English because she was from Hong Kong. None of those facts turned out to be true. And later in the story, the narrator says something really similar. I didn't put the quote up here, but the narrator says that when he was trying to be recruited, when he was meeting with corporate recruiters, that he was lying to sell himself, right, to be bought by a corporation or by recruiters. So he starts to align his experience, it's very different, but align it a little bit more with his mother's. Why might that be? I want to talk a little bit more about the neighbors. So the neighbor boy calls the paper animals trash. After all, they are made from scraps of Christmas wrapping paper. I think there's something about that also that's just so universal, a mother saving nice paper to make it into something else to console her child, to create something fun to play with. There's something just so relatable about that. So to other people, the toys are trash, even though the Obi-Wan Kenobi doll, at first to the narrator, doesn't seem all that interesting. He's told by Mark to look at the details of this toy, and he doesn't quite get why this plastic toy from the store is so much better. But then, of course, he comes to believe that it is and wants to get rid of his toys that have actual magic. We'll talk a little bit more about the animals later, but I noticed that the animals themselves, yes, they're made out of scraps of something, but they're also really tough. And they behave like the actual animal, right? The water buffalo actually wants to wallow. The tiger wants to pounce on things. And what they're made out of too, I love the reference to the shark that's made out of tinfoil because otherwise it would disintegrate in the water, and being wrapped in saran wrap. All of these things make me think of like preservation and toughness, but they're also very delicate. After all, they're made of paper and the mom has to tape them back together. This is not a fully formed thought here, but I noticed there was a reference to the goldfish bowl and also the box that's taped shut and then that's later put into the attic. Is there some symbolism to that? Is that a metaphor of something? These animals that have to be contained somehow, they have to be preserved, but they also begin to kind of fade. What could that be a metaphor for? Or maybe it's just that a goldfish has to live in a bowl and the animals have to go somewhere, right? It might not necessarily be a metaphor of anything. But I wondered if it had to do with preserving culture and heritage in some way, or protecting it, or maybe other people putting it in a box and when they don't understand it. But I wondered if that had some significance. What do you think? I already referenced these quotes, so we'll move on from this and talk more about how we can interpret these animals. If you were writing about the symbolism of the animals, you would probably want to do some research on origami, and in particular origami in China and the history of it and how it was passed down. I want to pull out this quotation beginning right here. I didn't know it at the time, but Mom's kind was special. She breathed into them, the origami, the paper animals, so that they shared her breath and thus moved with her life. This was her magic. Again, this is very specific, right? And of course, it's magical, and we don't understand the magic. I don't think the narrator understands the magic. But there's something also quite relatable about this. With any sort of handcrafted